Hey guys, what you're about to listen to is yet another special episode from my exclusive podcast, which can be found over at my YouTube membership, over at the Pacific War channel on YouTube, or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By the time of this recording, I have about 37 exclusive episodes and ongoing. This is, of course, a shameless plug, but for you Pacific War week-by-week audience members, I want to give you something extra. And perhaps, give you a place to go to once this is over, because I can assure you I only have a couple more. But stating all of that, I just want to give a big thanks to all of you for listening to me for so long. It was a long series, after all. And of course, you can still catch me at the Fall and Rise of China podcast, the Eastern Front week-by-week podcast, or my personal podcast, the Echoes of War podcast. That's enough of that. Let's get on with the show. Hey, before I begin the podcast, I just want to thank all of you who joined the Patreon. You guys are simply awesome. Please take the time to vote and comment on the Patreon polls so I can best tackle the subjects that you want to hear more about. And hell, it does not have to be about the Pacific War. I like things like ancient Rome, World War I, World War II. There's a ton of different subjects that I'm pretty knowledgeable about. So, let me know what you want and I'll try and make it happen. This podcast is going to be a very remarkable story about a Korean man who fought for the IJA, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany during the Second World War. He is also a man who most likely never existed. Did that catch you off guard? If you have a chance, you can now pull up a Wikipedia page and search Yangyong Jong. The first thing you will notice is a disclaimer that states numerous historians who claim Yangyong Jong does not exist. Yet this man exists in some history books, there is an iconic photo of him, there is a documentary looking into him, countless Korean stories are written loosely about him, there's also a pretty decent war film about him, and multiple YouTubers have, of course, covered his story. So, how does this guy not exist if the story is so popular? His story is claimed to be real by military historian Stephen Ambrose, who wrote about him in his book in 1994 titled D-Day, June 6, 1944, The Climatic Battle of World War II. There is also references to him in Antony Beevor's book, The Second World War, and that of defense consultant and author Stephen Zalogo's book, The Devil's Garden, Rommel's Desperate Defense of Omaha Beach on D-Day. In 2005, a Korean SBS documentary investigated his existence, and they concluded there was no convincing evidence of his existence. For those of you who have heard of this man, I guarantee it's because of the 2011 South Korean film, My Way. That's where I found out about it, by the way. Many of you probably saw the iconic photo of him. Again, if you pull up the Wikipedia page on Yangyong Jong, it's front and center. The photo shows an Asiatic man wearing a Wehrmacht uniform, and it seems he's just been captured by American forces on the D-Day landings. Now, I don't want to jump into the real or fake story business just yet. So this is how the podcast will go down. Very reminiscent of our Fake Histories podcast, might I add. I am a huge fan of that guy's work. I'm going to tell you a story of Yangyong Jong. Then afterwards, I will disclose my little investigation into whether he is real or not. It's kind of like I'm a detective. So without further ado, this is a story about a man who fought for three nations during World War II. It was June 1944. The Allies had just unleashed Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings at Normandy. Lieutenant Robert Brewer of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, was looking over the capture of Axis forces, and he reported to his regiment that he had found 4 Asians in Wehrmacht uniforms around Utah Beach. Brewer nor any of his colleagues spoke the language of the Asian men. They assumed them to be Japanese. The 4 Asians were processed as POWs, listed as young Japanese, and sent to a British POW camp before they would be sent to another POW camp in the United States. At some point between his capture and the POW camps, he gave his name as Yang Kyoungjong, stated he was a Korean, and he gave an extremely incredible story. To whom he said this story, nobody knows. Yang Kyoungjong was born in 1920 in Chungyo-jo, part of modern-day North Korea. At the age of 18, Yang was forcibly conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. Korea at the time was one of the breadbaskets of Asia, and the Empire of Japan had annexed her in 1910. Japan held sovereignty over Korea, making Koreans her subjects. In 1939, the Empire of Japan faced major labor shortages, and as a result, she began conscripting Japanese men for military work, while importing vast amounts of other people like Koreans as laborers to work in mainland Japan. For the Imperial Japanese Army, Koreans were not drafted until 1944, when things were very dire for Japan. Until 1944, the IJA allowed Koreans to volunteer in the army. In 1938, there was a 14% acceptance rate. By 1943, this dropped dramatically to 2%. But the number of applicants increased exponentially from 3,000 per annum in 1939 to 300,000 by the end of the war. On paper, it looked like the Koreans were registering en masse on their own volition, but this is quite the contrary. The Japanese policy was to use force. Japanese officials began press gang efforts against Korean peasants, forcing them to sign applications. It is believed over half of the applications were done in such a manner. Other applicants registered for a variety of reasons, typically because of economic turmoil. Korea would produce 7 generals and many field-grade officers. One of the most well-known ones was Lieutenant General and Crown Prince Yi-un, who would command Japanese forces in the China theater. Thus, Yang Kyoungjong was forced into the IJA, and he would find himself stationed with the Kwantung Army. Quite unfortunately for him, he was enlisted into their service at a time when 2 major border skirmishes occurred with the Soviet Union. The USSR was seen as Japan's #1 rival, going all the way back to the Triple Intervention of 1895 when the Russians thwarted Japan's seizure of the Liaodong Peninsula after they had just won the First Sino-Japanese War. This, of course, led to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, where Japan shocked the entire world by being victorious over the Russian Empire. When the Russian Empire fell and the Russian Civil War kicked off, Japan sent the lion's share of men to fight the Red Army during the Siberian Intervention of 1918 to 1922. Communism was seen as the greatest, if not one of the greatest threats to the Kokutai, and thus Japan as a whole. As such, Japan placed the Kwantung Army along the Manchurian borderlands to thwart any possible Soviet invasions. There had been numerous border skirmishes, but in 1938 and 1939, 2 large battles would occur. In 1938, the Kwantung Army intercepted a Soviet message indicating the Far East forces would be securing some unoccupied heights west of Lake Khasan that overlooked the Korean port city of Rajin. Soviet border troops did indeed move into the area, and they began fortifying it. The Kwantung Army sent forces to dislodge them, and this soon led to a full-on battle. The battle was quite shocking for both sides. The Soviets lost nearly 800 men dead, with 3,279 wounded. The Japanese claimed they had 526 dead and 913 wounded. The Soviets also lost a significant amount of armor, and despite both sides agreeing to a ceasefire, the Kwantung Army considered it a significant victory and proof the Soviets were not capable of thwarting them. Thus, in theory, Yang Kyoungjong would have been in training, but he would eventually reach the Manchuria borders by 1939. Another man who was sent over to this area was Georgy Zhukov, who was given the task of taking command of the 57th Special Corps to eliminate any Japanese provocations. What was expected of Zhukov was that if the Japanese pressed again for battle, he was to deliver them a crushing and decisive blow. On May the 11th of 1939, some Mongolian cavalry units were grazing their horses in a disputed area. On that very same day, Manchu cavalry attacked the Mongols, trying to drive them past the river of Khalkhin-Gol. 2 days later, the Mongols returned in greater numbers, and this time it was the Manchu who were unable to dislodge them. So what was really funny to say, a conflict over some horses grazing on disputed land would lead to a fully mechanized battle. On May the 14th, Lieutenant Colonel Yasuo Azuma led some regiments to dislodge the Mongols, but they were being supported by the Red Army now. Azuma's force suffered 63% casualties. It was absolutely devastating. June saw the battle expand enormously. Japan was tossing some 30,000 men into the region. The Soviets tossed Zhukov at them, alongside motorized and armored forces. The IJA lacked good armored units, so they tossed air forces to smash the nearby Soviet air base at Tamsakbulak. In July, the IJA engaged the Red Army with nearly 100 tanks and tankettes, to which Zhukov unleashed 450 tanks and armored cars. The Japanese had more infantry support, but the Soviet armor encircled and crushed them. The two armies sparred with another for weeks. The Japanese assumed the Soviets would suffer logistical problems, but Zhukov assembled a fleet of 2,600 trucks to supply his forces. It was simply incredible. Both sides were suffering tremendous casualties. Then in August, global politics shifted. It was apparent a war in Europe was going to break out. Zhukov was ordered to be decisive. The Soviets could not deal with a two-front war. So Zhukov, now using a fleet of 4,000 trucks, began transporting supplies from Chita to the front next to his armada of tanks and mechanized brigades. The Soviets tossed 3 rifle divisions, 2 tank divisions, and 2 tank brigades, nearly 500 tanks in all, with 2 motorized infantry divisions and 550 fighters and bombers. What had been a stalemate was absolutely shattered when Zhukov unleashed his armada. Some 50,000 Soviets and Mongols hit the east bank of Khalkhin-Gol. The Japanese were immediately pinned down, while the Soviets were employing a double envelopment. This saw Japanese forces on the other side of the border completely trapped. The Japanese tried to counterattack, and it failed horribly. Then the Japanese scrambled to break out of the encirclement, and they failed at that horribly. The surrounded Japanese forces refused to surrender as the Soviets smashed them with artillery and aerial bombardment. By the end of August, the Japanese forces on the Mongolian side of the border were completely annihilated. On September the 15th, the USSR and Japan signed a ceasefire. The Battle of Khalkhin-Gol was devastating for both sides. The Japanese claim they had 8,440 deaths and 8,766 wounded, while losing 162 aircraft and 42 tanks. It's estimated 500 to 600 Japanese forces were taken prisoner. Because of IJA doctrine, these men were considered killed in action. Some sources will claim the real numbers for the Japanese casualties could have been as high as 30,000. Meanwhile, the Soviets claimed 9,703 deaths, 15,251 wounded, and the destruction of 253 tanks, 250 aircraft, 96 artillery pieces, and 133 armored cars. Of those tank losses, it's estimated 75 to 80% were destroyed by anti-tank guns, 15 to 20% by field artillery, 5 to 10% by infantry who had thrown incendiary bombs, like Molotov cocktails, 3% to mines, and another 3% for aircraft bombing. Now back to Yang Kyoungjong. He, alongside the other Japanese, Manchu, and Korean POWs, were sent to gulags in Siberia. As the war on the Eastern Front kicked off between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, facing possible annihilation, the Soviets did anything possible to survive. One of these actions was to create the Strafbat, penal battalions. Stalin's Order Number 227 created the first penal battalions. They were supposed to be around 800 men strong. The first Strafbat battalion was deployed to the Stalingrad front on August 22nd of 1942. An order was issued on November the 26th of 1942, status of penal units of the army. It was issued by Zhukov, who was now deputy commander-in-chief and the man who was to formally standardize the Soviet penal units. The Strafbats were around 360 men per battalion, commanded by mid-range Red Army officers and politruks. The men forced into these were permanents or temporaries. Permanents were usually officers, commanders, the higher rank type of guys. Temporaries, known as the Strafniki, or punishees, were the grunts, typically prisoners and those convicted of crimes. From September of 1942 to May of 1945, 422,700 men would be forced into these penal battalions. Typically, those forced into penal military units were one of two things. Number one, those convicted of deserting their units or cowardice, or number 2, Soviet Gulag labor camp inmates. It seems Yang Kyoungjong found himself in a very awkward situation as he was being forced into one of those penal battalions and sent to fight on the Eastern Front. As pertaining to Order Number 227, each army was to have roughly 3 to 5 barrier squads of up to 200 persons each. These units would be made up of penal units. So back to Yang Kyoungjong. He would find himself deployed at the Third Battle of Kharkov. This battle was part of a series of battles fought on the Eastern Front. As the German 6th Army was encircling Stalingrad, the Soviets launched a series of wide counterattacks as pertaining to Operation Star. Operation Star saw massive offensives against Kharkov, Belgorod, Kursk, Voroshilovgrad, and Izium. The Soviets earned great victories, but they also overextended themselves. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, seeing the opening, performed a counterstrike against Kharkov on February 19th of 1943, using fresh troops of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps alongside 2 other panzer armies. Manstein also had massive air support from Field Marshal Wilhelm von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4. Over 1,214 aircraft would toss 1,000 sorties per day from February the 20th to March the 15th. The Red Army had approximately 210,000 troops who would fight in the Voronezh-Kharkov offensive. The Germans had roughly 160,000 men, but their tanks outnumbered the Soviets 7-1. They would have roughly 350 of them. The Germans quickly outflanked the Soviets, managing to encircle and annihilate many units. Whenever Soviet units made attempts to escape encirclements, the German air forces placed pressure upon them. The German air forces had the dual job of airlifting supplies to the front lines, giving the Soviets no breathing space. Gradually, the fight focused around the city of Kharkov, seeing the Soviets dislodged easily. The Germans caused severe casualties, perhaps 45,000 dead or missing, with another 41,000 wounded. The Germans themselves suffered 4,500 deaths, 7,000 wounded. The Germans took a large number of prisoners, and Yang Kyoungjong was one of them. Yet again a prisoner, Yang Kyoungjong was coerced into serving another nation. This time for the Ostbataillone. The Eastern Front had absolutely crippled Germany, and as a result, Germany began to enlist units from just about any nation possible, and this included former Soviet citizens. There were countless different units, like the Russian Liberation Army, Die Hilfswillige, the Ukrainian Collaborationists, and there were also non-Russians from the USSR, who formed the Ostbataillone. These eastern battalions would comprise a rough total of 175,000 men. Many of the Ostbataillone were conscripted or coerced into serving, though plenty also volunteered. Countless were recruited from POW camps, choosing to serve instead of in labor camps. The Osttruppen were typically deployed for coastal defense, rear area activities, security stuff, all the less important roles to free up the German units to perform frontline service. There were 2 different groups, the Ostlegionen, Eastern Legions, and the Ostbataillon, Eastern Battalions. The Ostlegionen were large Foreign Legion-type units raised amongst the members of specific ethnic or racial groups. The Ostbataillon were composed of numerous nationalities, usually plucked from POW camps in Eastern Europe. They were tossed together in a battalion-sized unit and integrated individually into German combat formations. Obviously, the Germans did not get their hands on a large number of Koreans, so Yang Kyoungjong would find himself in an Ostbataillone. In 1944, due to the massive amount of losses along the Eastern Front, and in preparation for the Allies about to open up a second front, the Germans began deploying a lot of the Ostbataillone along the coastal defense line at Cherbourg. Yang Kyoungjong was enlisted in the 709th Static Infantry Division, a coastal defense unit assigned to defend the eastern and northern coasts of the Cotentin Peninsula. This would include the Utah beach landing sites and numerous U.S. airborne landing zones. The sector was roughly 250 kilometers running northeast of Carentan via Barfreux, Cherbourg, Cap-de-la Hague to the western point of Banville. This also included the 65 kilometers of land just in front of the Cherbourg harbor. A significant portion of the 709th were Ostbataillone. Countless were from Eastern Europe. Many were former Soviet POWs. There was also 2 battalions of the 739th Grenadier Regiment, whom were Georgian battalions. A significant amount of the 709th had no combat experience, but had trained extensively in the area. The 709th would be heavily engaged on D-Day, meeting U.S. airborne units and the 4th U.S. Infantry Division who landed at Utah Beach. In the early hours of June the 6th, the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula and managed to secure a general area for the U.S. 4th Infantry Division to land at Utah Beach, with very few casualties compared to other beach landings. After the landings, the forces tried to link up with other forces further east. By June the 9th, they had crossed the Dove River Valley and captured Carentan. House-to-house fighting was seen in the Battle of Carentan, and the Germans tossed a few counterattacks, but the Americans held on with the help of some armor units of the 13th. The Americans then advanced to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, now supported by 3 other infantry divisions. The Germans had very few armored or mobilized infantry in the area. By June the 16th, the German command was tossed into chaos as Erwin Rommel wanted to pull out and man the Atlantic Wall at Cherbourg, but Hitler demanded they hold their present lines of defense. By the 17th, Hitler agreed to the withdrawal. Under some provisions, the men still took up limited defenses spanning the entire peninsula. On the 18th, the U.S. 9th Infantry Division reached the west coast of the peninsula, thus isolating the Cherbourg garrison. A battle was unleashed for over 24 hours with the 4th, 9th, and 79th U.S. Infantry Divisions driving north on a broad front. They faced little opposition on the western side and the eastern. The center held much stronger resistance. The Americans would find several caches of V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rocket installations at Brie. After 2 days, the Americans were in striking distance of Cherbourg. The garrison commander, Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schleben, had 21,000 men, but many were naval personnel and labor units. Schleben's 709th had performed a fighting withdrawal to Cherbourg, but were completely exhausted. The trapped forces were low in provisions, fuel, and ammunition. The Luftwaffe tried to drop supplies on their positions, but it was simply inadequate. A general assault began on the 22nd, and the German forces put up a stiff resistance within their concrete pillboxes. Allied warships bombarded the city on the 25th of June, and on the 26th, a British elite force, No. 30 Commando Unit, launched an assault against Octeville, a suburb of the southwestern portion of Cherbourg. The commandos quickly captured 20 officers and 500 men of the Kriegsmarine's Naval Intelligence HQ at Villa-Meurice. As the Germans were ground down, Schleben was captured, and with that, the surrender was made on the 29th. The Americans had suffered nearly 3,000 deaths with 13,500 wounded during the entire operation. The Germans suffered 8,000 deaths with 30,000 captured. For the 709th, who took the lion's share of the fighting, they reported sustaining 4,000 casualties. Amongst the captured was Yang Kyoungjong, and as I said in the beginning, it was Lieutenant Robert Brewer of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment 101st Airborne Division who was overlooking the capture of Axis forces when he reported to his regiment finding 4 Asians in Wehrmacht uniforms around the Utah Beach landings. Brewer, nor any of his colleagues, spoke the language the Asian men spoke. They assumed them to be Japanese. The 4 Asians were processed as POWs, listed as young Japanese, and sent to a British POW camp before they would be sent to another POW camp in the United States. At some point between his capture and the POW camps, he gave his name as Yang Kyoungjong, stating he was Korean, and he gave his story. Apparently, Yang Kyoungjong was granted U.S. citizenship and would spend the rest of his life in Illinois until his death in 1992. And so that is the story of Yang Kyoungjong. But did Yang Kyoungjong exist? Where does this story actually originate from? For those of you who have not guessed it yet, the story I just told you was full of extra details. It was I who added them based on historical events, with zero evidence at all that a man named Yang Kyoungjong was involved in any of them. I did this specifically to highlight that's exactly what others have done over the course of many years, creating a sort of mythos. If you know the game Broken Telephone, that's what I would theorize makes up most of this man's story. But now it's time to go through the actual evidence now, isn't it? From my investigation digging really deep, it seems to me the story originated with historian Stephen Ambrose, and his book in 1994 titled D-Day, June 6, 1944, The Climatic Battle of World War II. While writing this book, Ambrose interviewed one Robert Burnham Brewer, who served in E Company 2nd Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. By the way, yes, this is the same guy that was in Band of Brothers, by the way. Brewer gave one rather ambiguous account where he spoke about capturing 4 Asian men in Wehrmacht uniforms. So this here is Patient Zero, as told to us by Ambrose's book, on page 34, without any footnotes. The so-called Ost battalions became increasingly unreliable after the German defeat at Kursk. They were therefore sent to France in exchange for German troops. At the beach called Utah, on the day of the invasion, Lieutenant Robert Brewer of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, U.S. Army, captured 4 Asians in Wehrmacht uniforms. No one could speak their language. Eventually, it was learned that they were Koreans. How on earth did Koreans end up fighting for Hitler to defend France against Americans? It seems they had been conscripted into the Japanese army in 1938 Korea, which was then a Japanese colony. They were then captured by the Red Army in the border battles with Japan in 1939, forced into the Red Army, then captured by the Wehrmacht in December 1941 outside Moscow, forced into the German army, and then sent to France. What happened to them? Lieutenant Brewer never found out, but presumably they were sent back to Korea. If so, they would almost certainly have been conscripted again, either into the South or North Korean army. It is possible then in 1950 they ended up fighting once again, either against the U.S. Army or with it, depending on what part of Korea they came from. Such are the vagaries of politics in the 20th century. By June of 1944, 1 in 6 German riflemen in France was from a Ost battalion. Now digging a bit further, since there are no footnotes, it seems Ambrose took an oral account from Lieutenant Brewer, but he did not directly quote him, and instead abstractly expanded upon his story. Ambrose was guilty of doing this often in his work. As multiple historians have pointed out, Brewer was living in the 1940s, and was by no means an ethnographer. He was not a person who could have accurately known the nationality of the 4 Asian men he had captured. It is plausible he or other U.S. units around him just came up with Korean for the 4 Asians who could have been from nearly anywhere in Central or East Asia. For all we know, the men could have been from Turkestan. What was an Asian to Westerners of the 1940s is extremely broad. Now, if you look up the Ostbataillon or the Ostlegionen, you will see they were consisting of captured former Soviet soldiers. During the D-Day landings, 1/6 of the German forces defending the Atlantic coast were made up of the Ostbataillone. They came from numerous places: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, India, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkestan, Mongolia, numerous places in the USSR. Needless to say, there was a ton of people who would be considered Asian, and could be mistaken to be from places like Korea, Japan, Burma. It seems Brewer's vague account was transformed by Ambrose. But this only covers one part of all of this, the story. What about the iconic photo? The iconic photo is another matter entirely. The photograph has nothing to do with Brewer's account. It is simply a random photograph taken at Utah Beach of a captured Asian soldier wearing a Wehrmacht uniform. The official description of the photo states this: Capture Jap in Nazi uniform. France, fearful of his future. This young Jap wearing a Nazi uniform is checked off in a roundup of German prisoners on the beaches of France. An American Army captain takes the Jap's name and serial number. The author, Martin Morgan, believes the man in the photograph is not one Yang Kyoungjong, but instead an ethnic Georgian from the 795th Georgian Battalion, which was composed of Georgian Osttruppen troops, and the ethnicity of many of these men was Turkestani. To the untrained eye, a Turkestani person could look like a Korean. In 2002, word of the Ambrose story became more popularized online, and in 2004, the iconic photo was also beginning to circulate heavily on the internet. The Korean media became aware of the story in 2002, and when they saw the picture, the Korean news site DKB News investigated the matter. Apparently, an avid reader of DKB News submitted biographical details about the soldier in the photo, including his name, date of birth, the general story as we know it, his release, and his life and death in Illinois. The DKB News journalist who had received all this information from the man requested sources, but the man provided absolutely none. Typical. Thus, some random guy, a reader of the DKB News, gave a name, a place, a time of birth, and even where he ended up dying. In 2005, the Serial Broadcasting System aired a documentary specifically investigating the existence of Asian soldiers who fought for Germany on D-Day. In the SBS special titled The Korean in Normandy, produced and broadcast in 2005 based on rumors of one Yang Kyoungjong, they searched for records of Korean prisoners of war during the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, records of Korean people who participated in the German-Japanese War, and records related to the German Army's Eastern units, but they could not find traces of such a person. In addition, the soldiers who had served in the Soviet Army, who were captured and then transferred to the German Army's Eastern units, were considered by the Soviet Union to be serious traitors. Accordingly, under a secret agreement between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, they were forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union after the war and held in gulags. The SBS production team stated the rumors that a Korean from Normandy had gone to the United States and that he had died in seclusion near Northwestern University under the name of Yangyong Jong, which they were completely unaware of, was false. The investigative team looked for any traces of Yang Kyoungjong, and they found none. So they concluded, although there were accounts of Asian soldiers in the German army during World War II, there was zero evidence of the existence of one Yang Kyoungjong, or of any Koreans fighting at D-Day for that matter. The 2005 SBS special documentary sprang forth a bunch of stories by Korean authors expanding the mythos of Yang Kyoungjong. In 2007, the author, Jo Jong-rae, published a novel titled The Human Mask, which told the story of Shin Gil-man. This is how the story is described. The story ends with Shin Gil-man, who was conscripted into the Japanese army at the age of 20 as a prisoner of war in Normandy, then transported back to the Soviet Union and eventually executed by a firing squad. Another novel called D-Day by author Kim Byung-in was released in 2011, just prior to a film coming out. The plot is extremely similar to said movie. It is described as such. The main characters are Han Daek-sik and Yoichi, who met as children as the sons of a Japanese landowner and the house's housekeeper, harboring animosity towards another. They grew up and became marathon runners representing Joseon in Japan. As they experience the war together, they feel a strange sense of kinship, and they develop reconciliation and friendship. And of course, the most famous story would find its way to the big screen. In 2011, the film My Way came out, and back then it was the most expensive South Korean film ever made, at around $23 million. Then the next year, an unknown person created a Wikipedia page piecing together the Ambrose story, the iconic photo, and the unknown DPK reader's information. With all of this information becoming more viral, suddenly in 2013, two history books would hit the scene, and would you know it, both had Yang Kyoungjong in them. These are Anthony Beevor's book, The Second World War, and that of the defense consultant and author Stephen Zaloga in his book, The Devil's Garden, Rommel's Desperate Defense at Omaha Beach on D-Day. Both authors took the story, the name, and the iconic photo and expanded on the mythos by adding further details as to how a Korean man could have gone from Korea to Cherbourg, France. So Ambrose's story spread across the internet alongside this photo. Both sparked interest in Korea, and an investigation received some random guy's testimony, which, quite honestly, was groundless. Despite the Korean documentary stating there was no evidence of one Yang Kyoungjong, it sparked further interest, and there was more stories and a famous film made in 2011. 2012 saw the first wiki page, and it became even more viral. And now Yang Kyoungjong was seeping into other historical work. I could have ended the podcast right here, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the bizarre controversy that broke out in my home nation of Canada. A nation full of controversies today. Dear God. Debbie Hanlon, a city councillor in St. John, Newfoundland, was absolutely wrecked online in 2018 for an advertisement promoting her real estate business, stating this. By the way, you should really Google it. It's pretty funny. Korean Yang Kyoungjong fought with Japan against the USSR. He then fought with the USSR against Germany. Then with Germany against the US. Want an agent who fights for you? Call me. A really weird ad. So it seems her ad was to point out how far she was willing to go for her real estate clients. It was considered extremely offensive, and it wasn't the first time she tried to pull this kind of thing off. Her husband, Oral Muse, had recently come under fire for another ad he had made using a photo of a Puerto Rican cab driver named Victor Perez Cardona, where the vehicle he was driving turned into a casket. The ad read like this. He can't give you a lift because he's dead. He's propped up in his cab at his wake. Need a lift to a great service? Call me. Debbie Hanlon was surprised at the amount of backlash she received since the ads had been running for over 4 years online at that point. She claimed that she was the victim of cyberbullying and trolls. So yeah, that happened. Did Yang Kyoungjong exist? More than likely not. Was it possible some Koreans found themselves in a position similar to his story? Maybe. It's possible. During war, a lot of weird things happen. But I think we can all say that the story of Yang Kyoungjong is what we say in English is a tall tale. I really hope you like this episode. Please let me know in the comments on the Patreon what you think, how I can improve things, and of course, what you want to hear more about next. This has been Craig from the Pacific War Channel, over and out.